And if you say tithing, many people are going to say, that's all I'm going to give. And the only problem they have is, do they tithe on the gross or on the net? You know, I mean, how many times I've heard that go on? And we're not going to get into that tonight. But don't you think there is a problem even saying that tithing is a principle and not taking it completely out onto sacrificial giving?
I see tithing as a discipline that you can be challenged to start. Because anybody that I've been privileged to teach has gone from tithing to giving beyond the tithe. So when given, that's why I wanted to establish the principle of giving. You know, I said I wanted to say that before we go.
Is the principle a doctrine? I mean, we were asked that.
They're similar. They're similar in many respects. They're similar, and I like what somebody said that don't we think the tithe is obsolete now and all of that? And in a sense, yeah, because of the Old Testament way of practicing the tithe. I think I like what Russell has said as well about sacrificial giving. My question is, how do you get people to the point of sacrificial giving if there's no structured training that brings them to sacrificial giving? Nobody's going to wake up one morning and say, I'm going to give everything I've got. There's going to be a teaching process that brings people to the place of sacrificial giving. You see what I'm saying?
I could come back on that, but you come back on that, Russell.
There are churches out there that have been teaching tithing for generations, and they still got 20 or 30 members.
Okay.
The secret to a growing church is not that you teach tithing. I'll guarantee you don't teach tithing that often. I can tell. I'll bet you when you stand up before your church, you teach soul winning and evangelism and salvation sermons.
I do.
And your members run out that door, oh, I tithe today. No, they say, oh, people got saved today and I want more people to save. I'm going to give more because I want to get more people to save. It ain't got nothing to do with tithing. It's evangelism and personally teaching people how to lead others to Christ. They got nothing to do with tithing.
Okay.
John MacArthur in the United States has 20,000 member church. They don't teach tithing. Everybody says, how in the world is our church going to survive if we don't teach tithing? Preach soul winning and personal evangelism. It'll thrive. You ain't got to mention tithing. Okay. People are going to run out that church wanting to give money.
I think the thing I wanted to, that was very eloquently put, but better than I could have put it. But the thing I wanted to ask on that is you said, let's start with the tithe and move on. It seems to me that so many churches I hear that teach tithing never get beyond that. Every week it's tithing. You are saying, let's start with that tithing so that... I don't hear that happening.
Yeah, because you haven't listened to me. I'm sorry about that. Anyway,
okay.
The point I'm making is, R.T. Kendall, I have his book here, he talks a lot about tithing because he mentioned a few of the British guys. R.T. Kendall is one of the recent ones.
Was he British?
He was he was American, but he's American, but he was in the Westminster Chapel. Okay. So the point I'm making is this. You see, the whole concept of discipleship is process. And if we take the letter of the law and not the spirit of it, a lot of times we do more damage than good. In the sense that, for instance, when I hear, should the church teach tithing, my mind goes to, should the church teach giving? Rather than say tithing. Mm-hmm. Now, if the word tithing connotes Old Testament or alone, then, you could argue a point. But if the word tithing means tenth, then I could say, you know what? Abraham did it. So if I disciple anybody, for instance, I wouldn't teach them, once you've paid your tithe, you've done all. Mm-hmm. No. I'm going to let them understand that, as a believer, your whole life belongs to God.
Amen.
And so let me run. And so your respect for God's role in your finances starts by you honoring God with your time.
Absolutely, but I'm not convinced and that happens with the word tithing because don't you think that many people take that word tithing and actually just look upon it as like the Old Testament and the 10%.
Well, if they do that, that's because they either are not living out the reality of the New Testament themselves, or they're just limited in their understanding.
How much of tithing is actually taught in the New Testament, Russell?
After Calvary, Before Calvary, Jesus mentioned it 3 times, and in each case, he's actually condemning the tithe payers, the tithe teachers. So Jesus taught under the law. He was teaching matters of the law. And if Jesus had not taught tithing, he would have been a sinner. He could not have saved me. So Jesus had to teach tithing because it was under the law still. He also couldn't have taught the Gentiles to tithe because they wouldn't have accepted that. So he couldn't teach the Gentiles to tithe. Outside of Jesus, the only time tithing is mentioned is in Hebrews chapter 7. And there, let me say what Hebrews chapter 7 says. We believe this first use law, that the first time a text is used, it means more. Well, Hebrews 7:5 says, for the priest have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law. So you've got the first time in Hebrews the word tithe, the word commandment, and the word law appear. Therefore, I say verse 5 is a key verse. Well, you look at verse 12 and it says, for the priesthood being changed, there is of necessity a change also of the law. That's right. Well, it has to be referring at least to the law of tithing in verse 5, because it's the only other time in Hebrews 7 he's mentioned the word law. Well, what was the priesthood changed to? It was changed from Aaron to Melchizedek. Oh, but was it changed to paying the tithes to Levite and Aaron, or from them to the gospel workers? No, because in verse 18, he said, therefore there is a disannulling of the commandment going before. Well, the commandment going before is the priest have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law. Therefore, the change was from the commandment of the people to take tithes to it's being disannulled. It's been abolished. It no longer exists. I don't know how you can explain that any clearer.
Can you explain that any clearer?
Yes, I'll try. Now, what I read here is that he was saying that Melchizedek is a type of Christ. Now, once again, why would he be emphasizing that even the Levites gave tithe in the bosom of Abraham? What's the significance about that if he was trying to teach only the change of the Levitical priesthood? Why was he making it clear that there's the one who came in the person and the type of the Son of God to take tithes from Abraham, and even the Levites who were to take tithe under the law gave tithes in the bosom or in the loins of Abraham? That means that God must think something about the tithe. That's the way I read that. And so when I read the change of the Levitical priesthood, I also read the change of tithing from Aaron to Christ.
Okay. Okay.
What text?
What text?
What text says it was changed from Aaron to Christ?
The same one you just read.
Verse 18 says, therefore there is a disannulling of the commandment going before it.
Yes.
It didn't change it to Christ, it disannulled it.
Who is the new high priest? Who is the new high priest?
Yeah, but he's saying it's using the word abolished,
Look,
which
I'm
is
asking
there.
for a text. You
Yeah,
can give me
Which
one.
is...
Well, I can if you want.
So, yeah, okay. But on that, with that one thing, and maybe we're going to go to our audience, maybe some of them have got some thoughts on Hebrews 7 or some of the other things you've been talking about. Don't you feel that the lack of teaching of tithing in the New Testament is significant?
Yeah, there is some significance there. Like I said, when I started preparing for this, I realized how much that what the opposing view has to say has some point. But what it just did to me was to adjust my emphasis rather than take it out completely. In the sense that if the New Testament saints did not teach it directly as tithe, but inferred it many times, because if you read 1 Corinthians 9, when Paul was speaking, he said, didn't the Lord himself ordain that those who preach the gospel should live by the gospel? And he also referred to, if you have sown spiritual things, it's not great if you reap carnal things, and though you know those who minister about holy things in the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers at the altar. And all of this was taken from Numbers 18, and where the tithe was talked about. So I'll say, okay. I'll say that the lack of clear teaching on the tithe in the New Testament just helps me to see how I will adjust a bit, but not completely take it out, because of my understanding that it's a principle that can develop somebody to the point where they can give their all to God.
We're going to the audience, but Russell, just come back in a sentence or two to that.
1 Corinthians 9, he says it infers tithing. actually, the text is self-destructive, because 1 Corinthians 9:15 mentioned about those who worked in the temple were supported by things of the temple. But that opens the door to far more than tithing. It opens the door to all the the offerings, the sacrifices, the first fruits, and everything. Everything. So if 1 Corinthians 9 is talking about everything in the temple sanctuary, then you can't say verse 14 says, therefore even so, we live by Christian principles, because that would force us to teach everything verse 13 teaches. The principle is in 1 Corinthians verse 9, verses 7 through 14, is that each vocation or occupation provides principles for its own support. He mentions the herdsman, he mentions the soldier, he mentions the wine dresser, he mentions the ox grinding grain, he mentions the temple, and he finally gets to the principle for church support is principles of grace. We live by the principles of faith and grace in the new covenant. That's the new covenant. He is setting a principle that we live by it.
Okay. Any comments in the audience at this point? There were some earlier on. Yes, there's a lady over there. Then we'll take some more emails after that.
I've enjoyed listening to both sides of the arguments, for and against. I do believe in tithing, and I believe it shows discipline, it shows love, but I also think we need to remember that there is a lot of condemnation going on about people who don't tithe. So I think, we just have to remember that there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ, and that if you can't tithe, then I think you have to understand on some points. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's a gentleman right at the back in the corner there, the most inaccessible place.
Yeah, I firmly believe in tithing, and there's been a lot of talk tonight about condemnation in the church. But just because there's condemnation, it doesn't mean we should throw away the principle of tithing or the spiritual discipline of tithing. I began to tithe about 8 years ago, and I was afraid of finances. You know what I mean? I was living in a 2-bedroom flat with 3 children, and wasn't on a lot of money at all. And my pastor challenged me to tithe because he saw the spirit of fear. And I began to tithe, and within a few months I owned that flat, and I've had several pay rises, and my relationships have been better. But ultimately, it is a spiritual discipline, and consistently I'm challenged. Some months it seems tight, and I don't want to tithe, but it's that fear. It's the fear of finances, and also as a Christian, I'm a supernatural being. I shouldn't look to the natural. I should look to God and give in spite of what the bank balance says sometimes. And when I do that, even this month I was challenged. I gave more than my tithe. Within a couple of days, I had my tithe back through unexpected avenues. It's not all about money, but ultimately I plant seeds and I do reap a harvest.
Okay, thank you. Once again, there'll be a lot of people that would have a different view of that. Any other quick comments in the audience before we go to some emails? Yes.
I come back to the question.
Can you wait for the mic, please? Yeah.
I come back to the question, for example, is principle a doctrine? The Bible is very, very plain regarding this issue.
You answer that question for us then. Go on then.
No, he was blessed because he gave free will from his heart. It's nothing to do with tithing.
Okay.
As Russell basically indicated, tithing was to do with Israel and basically the fruits of the land. Nothing to do with Christians today. And for example, today, many Christians are under the bondage of false ministers who are stealing from them, and they must be exposed.
Okay. We'll try and get some more, but let's take some more emails and texts if we can. Thanks.
Okay. Hello. I would like to speak from personal experience. Due to some financial difficulties, I stopped paying a tenth of my income, but things got worse. But after much study and hearing God's voice, I started to pay my tithes again, and things began to get better. I got a little promotion, and my wife got a job. This is just my story. On the other side, we have one. Hi there, I've given above and beyond a tithe financially for years, but after I was made redundant, I have nothing but struggle financially for 10 years now. I am one of thousands of Christians who do not have a testimony of being blessed financially and yet have given thousands of pounds. Peter said, gold and silver have I none, Peter, an apostle, had no money. Why didn't he just start tithing to get more money? Why didn't he teach poor people to tithe so the curse of being poor could be broken?
Yeah.
I submit to you, because tithing to be blessed financially is false teaching in the